$12 million. That was the final bid for a pile of rust. My own family begged me to scrap. When my grandfather's will was read, I became the joke of Oak Haven County. My cousin inherited the fertile land, the mansion, and the fortune, while I was left with a seizing, broken-down combine harvester known as the Iron Coffin. Everyone told me I was a fool for keeping it, but they didn't know what was hidden inside that gray pitted iron. They didn't know that this piece of garbage was actually a lost piece of history that would destroy my cousin's ego and make me the richest farmer in the state. This is the story of how I turned a curse into a gold mine. The air in the conference room of Pendergast and Associates smelled of lemon polish and old money, a smell Caleb hated. It was the scent of things he couldn't afford. He sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, his work boots leaving a faint trace of dried mud on the pristine carpet. He tried to tuck them under the chair, conscious of the stares from across the table. Opposite him sat Silas. His cousin didn't have mud on his boots. Silas wore a tailored suit that cost more than Caleb's truck, and he checked his Rolex every 30 seconds, as if inheriting millions was taking up too much of his valuable time. Beside Silas sat Aunt Martha, dabbing dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, though Caleb hadn't seen her visit Grandpa Arthur once in the last 5 years. "Shall we proceed, Mr. Pendergast?" The executor adjusted his spectacles. He was a man who looked like he had been born specifically to deliver bad news. "Please," Silas said, leaning back. "I have a flight to catch." The commodities market doesn't wait for sentimentality. Caleb clenched his jaw. Grandpa Arthur had been the heart of the county, a man who farmed in dirt and rain until his back gave out. Silas was a commodities trader who farmed from a laptop in Chicago. It was a cruel joke that the fate of the family farm, Green Valley, rested between them. Pendergast cracked the seal on the thick envelope. Arthur Miller was a man of specific eccentricities. His last will and testament reflects that. He began reading. The legalese washed over the room, droning and heavy. "Then came the assets to my eldest grandson, Silas Miller," Pendergast read, his voice steady. "I bequeath the entirety of the southern fields, consisting of 600 acres of prime arable land, the main homestead, and all modern agricultural machinery currently housed in the east garage." Silas didn't smile, he just nodded, a predator acknowledging a kill. That was it, the heart of the farm. The revenue, the future. Caleb felt a cold stone settle in his stomach. He had worked those fields since he was 12. Silas hadn't touched a plow in decades. "And," Pendergast continued, shifting his gaze to the end of the table, "to my grandson Caleb, who stayed when others left." Caleb looked up, hope flickering like a dying candle. "I bequeath the north barn and its contents." Silence stretched in the room, a heavy, awkward silence. Then Silas let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. He covered his mouth quickly, but the mockery was evident. "The north barn?" Silas asked, a smirk pulling at his lips. "You mean the scrap heap, the one with the roof caved in?" "The north barn and its contents," Pendergast repeated stoically, "along with the 40 acres of scrubland immediately surrounding it." "That land is a swamp," Aunt Martha muttered, finally dropping the grieving act. "You can't grow soybeans in a marsh, Caleb." Arthur must have been senile. "He wasn't senile," Caleb said, his voice raspy. "He knew what he was doing." "Did he?" Silas stood up, smoothing his jacket. "He left me a multi-million-dollar operation, Caleb. He left you a pile of rusty garbage and a tax bill. The north barn hasn't been opened in 30 years. The only thing in there is raccoon droppings and that cursed combine he was obsessed with. The iron coffin, wasn't it?" "It's not garbage," Caleb defended, though he felt the weight of the humiliation burning his ears. "It is," Silas said, walking over and placing a patronizing hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Tell you what, cuz, I'm feeling generous. I'll give you 10 grand for the land. I need a place to dump the manure from the dairy expansion. You can keep the barn contents, sell the scrap metal, buy yourself a nice used truck." "I'm keeping it," Caleb said, shoving Silas' hand off. "Suit yourself." Silas grabbed his briefcase. "Enjoy the rust, Caleb. Don't come asking for a loan when the property taxes hit." Walking out of that office felt like walking into a funeral for his own life. Caleb drove his beat-up Ford F-150 out to the property. He watched Silas' sleek Mercedes turn left toward the main house, the house Caleb grew up in. Caleb turned right, down the overgrown gravel track leading to the north barn. The structure was leaning dangerously to the left. The red paint had long since peeled away to gray, weathered wood. Weeds grew waist-high against the sliding doors. It looked like a stiff breeze would flatten it. Caleb killed the engine. The silence of the countryside usually calmed him, but today it screamed of failure. 40 acres of swamp and a rotting shed. That was his inheritance. He grabbed a crowbar from his truck bed and approached the barn. The padlock was rusted solid. It took 3 heavy strikes to shatter the mechanism. With a groan of protesting hinges, Caleb heaved the heavy door open. Sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. The smell hit him first: old grease, damp rot, and the metallic tang of oxidation. And there it was, sitting in the center of the dirt floor, draped in tattered canvas tarps that had been chewed by generations of mice, was the behemoth. Caleb walked forward and pulled the tarp. It disintegrated in his hands, revealing the dull, pitted metal underneath. It was a combine harvester, but not like any he saw on the modern fields. It was ancient. The tires were flat and rotted away. The header was detached, lying in the dirt like a severed limb. It was ugly, bulky, and painted a strange, non-commercial shade of gray. This was the machine Grandpa Arthur had bought just after the war. The machine that had broken down the first week he ran it, nearly bankrupting him. The family called it the Iron Coffin because it had buried Arthur's savings. Caleb kicked the tire rim. It rang hollow. "Thanks, Grandpa," Caleb whispered to the empty barn, tears finally stinging his eyes. Thanks for nothing. He didn't know it then, standing in the gloom of his failure, but he was staring at a ghost. And ghosts, as it turns out, have expensive tastes. The first week was a lesson in despair. The reality of Caleb's financial situation hit him harder than the smell of the swamp. He had $400 in his checking account. The property taxes on the 40 acres were due in 3 months, and they were substantial, nearly $5,000. Silas wasn't joking about the tax burden. Even scrubland cost money to own. Caleb set up a cot in the corner of the barn. He couldn't afford rent in town, and Silas had made it clear he wasn't welcome at the main house. He lived off canned beans and instant coffee made on a camping stove, staring at the gray monster that dominated the room. His phone rang on Tuesday. It was Mr. Cole. "Henderson from the bank." "Caleb, I'm looking at the accounts," Henderson said, his tone apologetic but firm. "With your grandfather's passing, the co-signed loans for your truck and the operating line of credit are being called in. The estate settled Silas' portion, but, well, your portion is outstanding." "How much?" Caleb rubbed his temples, grease smearing his forehead. $18,000. We need a significant payment by the end of the month, or we'll have to repossess the truck and put a lien on the north acreage. Caleb hung up and looked at the combine. "You're all I've got," he muttered. He decided to strip it. If he could salvage the engine block, maybe the heavy steel chassis, he could get scrap value. Iron prices were decent. It wouldn't pay the whole debt, but it might buy him a month. He started with the easy stuff. He cleared the debris, shovel by shovel, tossing the rat nests and old straw out the back door. Then he took a wire brush to the side panels. He needed to see what he was working with. As he scrubbed away 50 years of grime, he noticed something odd. Usually, old farm equipment was simple bolts, welds, basic steel. But the machining on this combine was precise. Too precise. The bolts weren't the standard hex heads he was used to. They had strange, triangular markings on the heads. He moved to the engine compartment. The hood was seized, so he had to use a blowtorch to heat the hinges. When he finally pried it open, he coughed as a cloud of rust dust puffed out. He shone his flashlight inside. It wasn't the standard engine he expected. He was expecting an old International Harvester, or maybe a Massey engine. This block was massive and inline-8 configuration that looked more like something out of a locomotive than a piece of farm equipment. "What in the world are you?" Caleb whispered. He reached in to wipe grease off the identification plate riveted to the block. "Property of." The rest was scratched out, deeply gouged as if someone had taken a chisel to it deliberately. Beneath that, a serial number, AXP001X. Experimental? Caleb frowned. He spent the next 3 days obsessed. He stopped trying to scrap it and started trying to understand it. He dismantled the seat, a leather bucket seat that was surprisingly comfortable despite the rot. Underneath the seat cushion, jammed into the springs, was a metal box. It was a lockbox, welded shut by rust. Caleb took it to the workbench. He used an angle grinder to carefully cut the hinges. The sparks flew, lighting up the dark barn like fireworks. With a clang, the lid fell off. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a logbook and a set of blueprints. Caleb unfurled the blueprints on the dusty floor. They were hand-drawn, dated October 1938. The header on the blueprint didn't say John Deere or Case. It said Project Demeter, classified. Crest, he opened the logbook. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. Entry, November 12, 1938. The prototype is functional. The yield efficiency is double anything on the market. But they are watching. The corporations won't let this see the light of day. They want to bury it. They want to melt it down. Entry, December 4, 1938. I have to hide it. I've painted it gray. I've stripped the badges. I sold it to a farmer in Oakhaven, a man named Arthur Miller. He doesn't know what it is. I told him it was a custom job. It's the only way to keep it safe. If Ford or the others find it, they'll destroy it. Caleb sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. Grandpa Arthur hadn't bought a lemon. He had bought a fugitive. The sound of tires on gravel snapped him out of his trance. He quickly shoved the blueprints back into the box and threw a tarp over the engine. Silas walked into the barn, not bothering to knock. He was followed by a man Caleb didn't recognize, a tall, severe-looking man in a black trench coat. "Still playing in the dirt, Caleb," Silas sneered, looking around with distaste. "Place smells worse than I remember. What do you want, Silas?" Caleb stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm here to help you," Silas said, though his eyes were cold. "This is Mr. Blackwood. He represents a private collector of vintage scrap metal. He's interested in clearing this junk out for you." Mr. Blackwood stepped forward. He didn't look like a scrap dealer. He looked like a shark in human skin. He walked straight to the combine, his eyes scanning the gray paint with an intensity that made Caleb uneasy. "It's in terrible condition," Blackwood said, his voice smooth and deep. "But I have a client who needs parts for a museum display. Generic 1940s parts. I'll offer you $5,000. Cash, today. $5,000. It would pay the taxes. It would buy him food. And," Silas added, "I'll throw in another $5 for the land. $10,000, Caleb. You can walk away from this mess. Go to the city. start over. Oh, Caleb looked at the blueprints hidden on the workbench. He looked at Mr. Blackwood, who was currently running a gloved hand over the engine cowl, right where the serial number EXP01X was hidden. Blackwood's hand lingered there. He knew. Somehow, this stranger knew exactly where to look. "Why?" Caleb asked. "Why do you want it so bad? It's just rust." "Charity," Silas lied. "I want this eyesore gone from the property line." "I think the offer is generous," Blackwood said, turning to Caleb. "You won't get a better one. The metal is pitted. It's essentially worthless." Caleb remembered the logbook. "They want to bury it." "No," Caleb said. Silas blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said no. It's not for sale." "Not yet." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the barn seemed to drop. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Miller. It's just a matter of price." "Get off my land," Caleb said, grabbing the crowbar he had used to open the door. Silas laughed, shaking his head. "You're an idiot, Caleb. You're going to lose everything. The bank will take this place in a month, and then I'll buy it at auction for pennies. You're delaying the inevitable." "Maybe," Caleb said. "But today, you're leaving." As they walked back to the luxury car, Caleb watched Blackwood pull out his phone. He wasn't calling a scrapyard. He was making a call that looked urgent. Caleb locked the barn door using a new padlock he'd bought with his last $20 and went back to the logbook. He flipped to the back page. There was a name written there, a contact for, in case of emergency. Dr. Evelyn Stone, Curator, Industrial History Museum, Smithsonian. Caleb looked at the phone number. It was an old exchange, probably dead decades ago. But the name, Evelyn Stone. He pulled out his smartphone and typed the name into the search bar. The first result was an obituary from 1998. But the second result was a news article from a farming trade journal. The myth of the ghost harvester. Did the ultimate machine ever exist? Caleb read the article. It described a machine built by a rogue engineer named Thomas Thorne in the late 30s. A machine that was rumored to be 50 years ahead of its time, utilizing a threshing system that wouldn't be invented until the 1980s. The article ended with a quote from a collector. "If the ghost harvester still exists, it is the holy grail of agriculture. It's not just a tractor, it's the Mona Lisa of iron. It would be worth millions." Caleb looked up at the gray beast. "Millions," he whispered, "but to get it, he had to prove this was the one. And he had to do it before the bank took the farm, or before Mr. Percy." Blackwood came back with something more dangerous than a checkbook. The rain in Oak Haven didn't wash things clean. It just turned the world into mud. For 3 days it hammered against the tin roof of the north barn, a relentless drumbeat that matched the pounding in Caleb's head. He hadn't slept in a bed for 96 hours. His world had shrunk to the 40-foot circle of light cast by a halogen work lamp he'd rigged to a portable generator. The air was thick with the smell of penetrating oil, stale coffee, and the unique, sharp scent of old iron being disturbed from a decades-long slumber. Caleb lay on his back on a mechanic's creeper, slid underneath the belly of the beast. Cold dirt seeped through his coveralls. Above him hung the massive undercarriage of the combine. He was fighting a war against seizure. Every bolt was a battle. Every nut was fused to its thread by 50 years of oxidation. "Come on," Caleb gritted out, his knuckles white around a breaker bar. "Give." He was working on the threshing drum housing. According to the blueprints he'd found in the lockbox, this was where the secret lay. The blueprint labeled it the axial flow cyclonic separation system. A 1938 combines used a Walker system, essentially shaking the straw to separate the grain. It was slow and inefficient, but the drawings described a rotor, a spinning cylinder that used centrifugal force. It was technology that International Harvester wouldn't introduce to the public until the late 1970s. If this machine actually had a functional rotor system from the 30s, it rewrote the history of agriculture. He applied more torque. The metal groaned. A high-pitched squeal echoed in the barn, followed by a sudden crack that sounded like a gunshot. Caleb flinched, dropping the wrench. Had he sheared the bolt? If he broke these bolts, he couldn't replace them. They were custom forged. He shone his flashlight upward. The nut had turned, 1/4 of an inch. Thank God, he breathed. He spent the next 6 hours carefully removing the access panel. When the heavy steel plate finally came loose, it nearly crushed his chest as he lowered it to the ground. He dragged himself out from under the machine and stood up, his back popping audibly. He wiped the grease from his eyes and looked inside the machine's gut. There it was. It didn't look like any threshing drum he'd ever seen on the modern John Deere's Silas least. It was a masterpiece of industrial art. The rotor was spiraled with aggressive hardened steel rasps arranged in a perfect Fibonacci sequence. Even covered in a layer of dried, petrified grease, the engineering was undeniable. It was beautiful, and it was completely preserved. The oilcloth seals, though brittle on the outside, had kept the internal chamber airtight. There was no rust on the rotor, just gleaming gunmetal gray steel. Caleb ran a gloved hand over the intake. "You were too fast," he whispered to the ghost of Thomas Thorne, the engineer. "The world wasn't ready for you." His reverence was interrupted by the vibration of his phone on the workbench. It was 2 a.m. The caller ID said restricted. Caleb's stomach tightened. He wiped his hands on a rag and answered. "Hello, Mr. Burr?" "Miller." The voice was smooth, digitalized, but the cadence was familiar. "It was Blackwood. I trust you're enjoying the rain." Caleb looked toward the barn doors. They were barred from the inside, but the darkness outside suddenly felt crowded. "It's late, Blackwood. How did you get this number?" "We are prepared to increase our offer," Blackwood said, ignoring the question. $50,000, cash. Delivered by courier tomorrow morning. You simply hand over the keys and the deed to the barn. 50,000. Caleb laughed, a dry, humorless sound. That would unravel his entire world. A new pickup truck these days. You and I both know what's inside this barn is worth a lot more than that. There was a pause on the line, a long, heavy silence. "Be careful, Caleb," Blackwood said softly. "Greed is a dangerous thing for a man with no leverage. The bank called your note, didn't they? You have, 2 weeks before foreclosure proceedings begin. If you wait for an auction, you'll lose the farm before the gavel falls. Take the 50, walk away." "Oh, I'm not selling," Caleb said, and hung up. He stood there shaking. 50,000 was life-changing money for a man with $400 to his name. It would clear his debt. He could leave. But then he looked at the combine. He looked at the blueprint taped to the wall. This wasn't just a machine. It was Grandpa Arthur's secret. Arthur had bought this, hidden it, and kept it safe for 50 years, knowing that one day it would save the family. Silas had the land, but Caleb had the legacy. He couldn't sell. He went back to the machine, but his focus was broken. He kept hearing sounds outside, the snap of a twig, the crunch of gravel. Paranoia was setting in. He needed help. He couldn't restore this beast alone, and he certainly couldn't protect it alone. He needed someone who knew old iron better than anyone alive. He needed Gus. Gus Sprocket Halloway lived in a trailer 5 miles down the county road, surrounded by a graveyard of tractors dating back to the Great Depression. Gus was 82, half-blind, and mean as a rattlesnake, but he could diagnose a misfiring piston by holding a screwdriver to the engine block and listening to the vibrations. Caleb drove the F-150 into Gus's yard the next morning. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy gray mist clinging to the fields. Gus was sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of cedar. He didn't look up as Caleb approached. "You look like hell, boy," Gus grunted. "Good to see you too, Gus." Caleb leaned against the porch railing. "I need your eyes on something. I heard about Arthur," Gus said, finally looking up. His eyes were milky with cataracts but sharp. "And I heard about the screwing you got at the reading. Left you the north barn, huh? That heap of scrap?" "It's not scrap, Gus. It's an eyesore. I told Arthur in '74 to melt it down. Ugly gray bastard. Never ran right. It never ran right because nobody knew how to run it," Caleb said. He pulled the folded blueprints from his jacket pocket. "Look at this." Gus squinted, taking the paper. He adjusted his thick glasses. He studied the drawing for a long time. His chewing tobacco stopped moving in his cheek. He traced the line of the rotor with a calloused thumb. "Where did you get this?" Gus asked, his voice losing its gravelly edge. "It was in a lockbox under the seat. It's the combine, Gus. The gray one." "This?" Gus shook his head. "This is a dual-rotor axial flow. This shouldn't exist. Not on paper dated 1938. This is impossible. It's real. It's in the barn. I opened the housing last night. It's all there." Gus stood up, dropping his whittling knife. "Let's go." Trive back was silent. When they got to the north barn, Caleb felt a strange knot in his stomach. The tire tracks in the mud near the entrance were wrong. He had parked his truck to the left, but there were fresh dually tracks, wide, heavy mud tires cutting across the grass to the right side of the barn. "You expecting company?" Gus asked, gripping the dashboard. "No." Caleb slammed the truck into park and jumped out. The padlock on the front door was intact. He let out a breath. Maybe it was just kids turning around. He unlocked the door and slid it open. The smell hit him instantly. Not grease, not old hay. Gasoline. "Don't turn on the light." Gus shouted, grabbing Caleb's shoulder with surprising strength. Caleb froze, his hand inches from the generator switch. The fumes were overpowering. He pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the darkness. The barn had been tossed. The tool chest was overturned, wrenches scattered like shrapnel. The blueprints he had taped to the wall were torn down and shredded. But the combine, someone had climbed on top of the engine deck. The fuel cap was off. A red jerry can lay on its side on the floor, empty. They had poured 5 gallons of gasoline all over the engine block and down into the intake. They didn't want to burn it, Caleb realized, his voice trembling with rage. They wanted me to burn it. If he had started the generator, the spark might have ignited the fumes. If he had tried to crank the combine engine, the gas poured into the cylinders would have caused a hydrostatic lock, shattering the pistons, or ignited and blown the engine block apart. "Professional," Gus muttered, walking carefully around the puddle. "This wasn't kids. This was a hit." Caleb walked to the back of the machine. The tires had been slashed. Not just punctured long, jagged gashes made with a heavy knife. "Silas," Caleb spat the name. "Maybe," Gus said, kneeling by the tire. "Or maybe someone who wants Silas to look like the good guy." "Look here." Gus pointed to the mud near the rear axle. There was a footprint. It wasn't a work boot. It was a smooth-soled tactical boot, the kind security contractors wore. "Blackwood," Caleb said. "Whoever it is, they're done playing nice," Gus said. "They can't steal it, because it's too big and too conspicuous. So they're going to break it so you can't sell it. If this thing doesn't run, it's just scrap metal. No museum pays millions for a non-functional pile of rust. Can we fix it?" Caleb looked at the gas-soaked engine. Gus spat tobacco juice onto the dirt floor. "The tires are shot. We'll have to find rims that fit. maybe off an old logging skidder. The engine, we have to drain it, strip it, clean every inch before we even think about turning it over. It's a week of work, maybe 2. I have 10 days before the bank moves in, Caleb said. Then we better stop yapping and start mopping, Gus said. They worked in silence for the rest of the day, carefully soaking up the gasoline with bags of kitty litter Caleb bought from town. They opened every door and window to vent the fumes. Around 4 p.m., a sheriff's cruiser rolled down the driveway. Sheriff Brody was a good man, but he had been high school quarterback to Silas wide receiver. In a small town, that bond went deeper than the law. Caleb met him outside. "Afternoon, Caleb," Brody said, tipping his hat. "Got a call from a neighbor. Said there was a strong smell of gas coming from here. Concern about a fire hazard." "A neighbor?" Caleb scoffed. "My nearest neighbor is a mile away." "You mean Silas called. Silas is concerned about you, Caleb. He says you're living in a condemned structure." Brody looked at the barn. "And I gotta say, smelling those fumes, he might be right. If this place is a hazard, I have to red tag it. Someone broke in, Brody." Caleb pointed to the tracks. "Look at the tires." "Someone poured gas on my equipment." Brody looked at the tracks, then shrugged. "Looks like mud, Caleb. And honestly, it looks like you spilled some fuel trying to get that junk running. Look, I don't want to be the bad guy, but if I come back and this place smells like a refinery, I'm condemning the building. You can't sleep here anymore. It's not safe." "Where am I supposed to go?" Silas said he'd pay for a motel in town for a few nights, just until you sort things out. Caleb stared at the sheriff. It was a squeeze play. Get him out of the barn so they could come back and finish the job. "I'm staying," Caleb said. "I'll clean it up." "But I'm not leaving," Brody sighed. "Fine, but I'm filing a report." "You're on thin ice, Caleb." When the cruiser left, Caleb turned to Gus. "They're going to come back tonight," Caleb said. "They know I'm still here." Gus wiped his hands on his greasy overalls. "Let 'em come. I got a 12 gauge in my truck, and I'm too old to go to jail for long." "No guns," Caleb said. "We need to be smarter. We need to get this thing running, and we need to do it somewhere they can't find us." "Move it," Gus laughed. "It has no tires, the engine is flooded, and it weighs 10 tons. How are we going to move it?" Caleb looked at the heavy-duty lowboy trailer sitting in the weeds behind the barn, another remnant of Grandpa Arthur's hoarding. It was rusted, but the frame was solid. "We don't need to move it far," Caleb said, his mind racing. "Just somewhere they won't look. Somewhere Silas would never set foot." "Where?" Caleb looked toward the south, past the property line, toward the dense, tangled woods of the Black River bottoms. It was treacherous, muddy, and mosquito-infested. "The old logging camp," Caleb said. "The one past the swamp. The road is washed out, but if we wait for the ground to freeze tonight, we might make it." "You're crazy," Gus smiled, revealing yellow teeth. Arthur was crazy too. "I miss this." "We need a tractor to pull the trailer," Caleb realized. "Silas has all the tractors." Gus reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. "I didn't drive my truck here just for the scenery, kid. I got an old Case 970 parked at my place. She's ugly, but she pulls like a freight train. You help me get the tires off that skidder in my yard, and we'll get this ghost moving." The sun began to set, casting long blood-red shadows across the farm. The war for the iron coffin had begun, and Caleb knew that by morning he would either be a fugitive hiding a multi-million-dollar secret in the woods, or a man with nothing left but ash. He grabbed the shovel. "Let's dig." The temperature dropped to 20 degrees that night. The mud of the swamp road froze into a jagged, treacherous lattice of ruts and ice. It was the only luck Caleb had encountered in weeks. At 3 a.m. the convoy moved. It was a funeral procession for the living. In the lead was Gus's battering ram of a tractor, the Case 970, its headlights taped over with duct tape to leave only narrow slits of illumination. Behind it, groaning under 10 tons of steel, was the lowboy trailer. And strapped to that trailer, covered in dark canvas, was the ghost harvester. Caleb drove the tractor. He could feel the trailer swaying dangerously as they navigated the washouts. Every creak of the hitch sounded like a gunshot in the silent woods. "Easy, boy," Gus whispered from the jump seat, clutching a thermos of coffee. "Don't tip her. You tip her here, she stays here forever." They were moving deeper into the Black River bottoms, a place where GPS didn't work and the cell service died. They reached the old logging camp just before dawn. It was a natural fortress clearing surrounded by dense pine that blocked aerial views, with a rusted tin shed that was just big enough to hide the machine. They unloaded the beast as the first gray light filtered through the trees. They were exhausted, their hands numb, but they were safe. Back at the farm, the sun rose on a scene of confusion. At 8 a.m., Sheriff Brody and Silas arrived at the North Barn with an eviction notice and a condemnation order. Silas was smiling, already on the phone with the demolition crew. "Tear it down," Silas was saying. "I want the ground leveled by." He stopped. The barn doors were wide open. Brody walked in, his hand resting on his holster out of habit. The barn was empty. The oil stains were there. The rat nests were there, but the massive gray combine was gone. "Where is it?" Silas screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. "Where is the scrap?" Brody looked at the ground. The frozen mud had preserved the tracks leading out, but they disappeared onto the county road, where morning traffic had already obliterated the trail. "He moved it," Brody said, scratching his head. "I didn't think that thing would roll." "He stole it," Silas yelled. "That iron is part of the estate's visual equity until the tax lien is settled." "Actually," Brody corrected him, "the will gave him the contents. He can move it, but he can't hide from the bank. The auction is in 4 days, Silas. If he doesn't pay the 18 grand by noon on Saturday, the bank seizes everything, including that pile of junk, wherever he hid it." For 4 days, Caleb and Gus lived in the woods. They worked 20-hour days. They didn't have a shop. They had a portable generator and a toolbox. They drained the engine. They pulled the injectors and soaked them in solvent. They rewired the ignition system using scavenged copper wire. The hardest part was the tires. Gus had found 4 monster tires from a logging skidder. They didn't fit the combine's hubs. They had to hand-drill new bolt patterns into the inch-thick steel rims using a magnetic drill press Gus had saved from the 80s. It was brutal, back-breaking work. On the 3rd night, Caleb was polishing the XB001X serial number plate. "Do you think it will start?" Caleb asked. He was covered in soot, his eyes dark with fatigue. Gus spat into the fire they had built. "It's an inline 8, Caleb. Built before they designed engines to fail after 10 years. If she has compression, she'll run. The question ain't if she runs. The question is if anybody cares." Caleb pulled out his phone. He had 1 bar of signal if he stood on the roof of the shed. He had sent an email to the contact he found online, the successor to Dr. Evelyn Stone at the Smithsonian. He attached photos of the blueprints and the serial number. He hadn't received a reply. "Tomorrow is the auction," Caleb said. "The bank is auctioning off the North Barn land and all recovering assets at the county fairgrounds." "Then we better be there," Gus said, "and we better make an entrance." The Oak Haven County Fairgrounds smelled of funnel cakes and livestock. Usually this was a happy place. Today it was the site of Caleb's execution. The auction block was set up in the main pavilion. A crowd of about 200 people had gathered. Most were just curious neighbors, here to watch the Miller family drama play out. In the front row sat Silas, looking immaculate in a navy suit. Next to him was Mr. Blackwood, looking bored, checking his watch. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Jimmy Ray, took the microphone. "All right, folks, settle down. We have a liquidation auction today for the Miller estate, specifically the north parcels. We are selling the land and any equipment associated with the seizure." He started with the land. Silas bought it for pennies on the dollar. No one dared bid against him. Sold to Silas Miller for $12,000. Jimmy Ray boomed. Caleb wasn't there. The crowd murmured. Had he skipped town? "Now," Jimmy Ray continued, "we have the outstanding debt of Mr. Barthon. Caleb Miller, the bank has authorized the sale of. Well, we have a list here, a 2008 Ford F-150, and a vintage combine harvester, location currently unknown, but title to transfer upon recovery." The crowd laughed. "Do I hear $100 for the title to the ghost machine?" Jimmy Ray joked. "500, a voice shouted. It was a scrapper from out of town. 1,000, Blackwood said lazily, not even raising his hand. "I have 1,000, Jimmy Ray chanted. "Do I hear 15? "Vero." The sound didn't come from the speakers. It came from the west gate of the fairgrounds. It was a low, thrumming bass note that vibrated the bleachers. It sounded like a B-17 bomber taxiing for takeoff. The crowd turned. Silas stood up. Crashing through the wooden gate, snapping the chain like it was thread, came the iron coffin. But it wasn't a rust bucket anymore. Caleb and Gus had buffed the gray paint with oiled rags until it had a menacing gunmetal sheen. The massive skidder tires gave it a predatory stance. The front end lifted high. The engine, that monstrous inline-8, was roaring open header, spitting blue flame. Caleb sat in the open cab, wearing his dirty coveralls. Gus rode on the side step, holding a shotgun, pointed at the sky, thankfully. Caleb drove the machine right up to the auction block, the massive tires stopping inches from Silas' Mercedes. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb hopped down. He walked up to the auctioneer and slammed a piece of paper on the podium. "It's not lost," Caleb said, his voice amplified by the stunned silence. "It's right here, and it's for sale." Blackwood stood up. His boredom was gone. He looked at the machine with a hunger that was terrifying. "This is a farce," Silas shouted. "Get that junk out of here." "Oh, it's part of the auction, Silas," Caleb yelled back. "You wanted it sold. Let's sell it." Jimmy Ray, sensing the drama and the commission, grabbed the mic. "Well, it appears the merchandise has been delivered. Bidding is at $1,000 with the gentleman in the black coat." "10,000, a voice rang out from the back. The crowd parted. A woman in a sharp gray pantsuit walked forward. She was holding a phone to her ear. "Who are you?" Silas demanded. "I represent the archives of the Smithsonian Institution," she said, her voice clear. "And we have verified the serial number provided by Mr. Miller. This is the Thorn prototype. It is the only one in existence. 20,000, Blackwood barked. 50,000, the woman counted instantly. 100,000, Blackwood said. The crowd gasped. Silas looked at Blackwood. "What are you doing?" "It's scrap." "Shut up," Blackwood hissed. "It's worth more than your life." 200,000, the woman said. 500,000, Blackwood's voice was icy. $1 million. The air left the pavilion. $1 million. Caleb leaned against the massive tire of his machine, his heart pounding so hard he thought he might pass out. Gus just grinned and packed a fresh lip of tobacco. 2 million, Blackwood said. He was sweating now. 5 million, the woman said. She wasn't even blinking. My donors are very interested in the patent history, Mr. Blackwood. They know who your employers are. They know why you want to destroy it. 7 million, Blackwood screamed. $10 million, the woman said calmly. Blackwood froze. He looked at his phone. He made a frantic call, but whoever was on the other end must have said no. He slammed the phone into the dirt, shattering it. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd without a word. I have $10 million, Jimmy Ray's voice cracked. Do I hear, God help me? Do I hear 11, 12 million? A new voice said. It was an old man, in jeans and a flannel shirt, standing near the concession stand. Nobody knew him. He walked forward. I'm from Deere and Company, the man said simply. We'd like to bring it home to the headquarters. We can't let the Smithsonian have all the fun. 12 million. The Smithsonian representative looked at her phone, listened for a moment, and then shook her head. It's yours. Going once, Jimmy Ray screamed. Going twice, Sate. For $12 million. The gavel slammed down. It sounded like a pistol shot ending the war. Caleb fell to his knees in the dirt. Gus patted him on the back. Silas stood there, his mouth open. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the check the Deere representative was already writing. Caleb, Silas stammered, putting on a fake smile, walking over. "'Cause we did it. The family, we really hit the jackpot, didn't we? I mean, since the estate isn't fully settled." Caleb stood up. He took the check from the buyer. He looked at the zeros. $12,000. The will was specific, Silas, Caleb said, his voice quiet. You got the land. I got the contents of the barn. Pendergast was very clear. But the taxes, Silas pleaded. The overhead. We're partners. No, Caleb said. We aren't. Caleb turned to the Deere representative. Take care of her. She's stubborn. We will, son, the man said. Caleb walked over to Gus. How much is your truck worth, Gus? About $2,000 on a good day. Here, Caleb wrote a personal IOU on the back of a napkin for $1 million. Buy a new one. As Caleb walked out of the fairgrounds, leaving Silas screaming at his lawyer in the dust, he didn't look back. He had bought his freedom with rust, and as for the farm, well, with $12 million, he figured he could buy a pretty nice spread of his own, maybe even the one right next door to Silas, just to remind him every day of what happens when you laugh at a miller. Caleb Miller's story isn't just about a lucky find. It's a testament to the value of things and people that society deems broken or useless. His grandfather Arthur knew the true worth of the iron coffin, not because of its monetary value, but because of the innovation and history it held. Silas saw rust and saw only garbage. Caleb saw rust and saw potential. In a world obsessed with the shiny and new, Caleb proved that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden beneath layers of dirt, waiting for someone with enough grit to wipe them clean. He didn't just inherit a combine, he inherited the last laugh. If you enjoyed the story of karma, rust, and redemption, make sure to smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What would you do if you found a piece of history worth $12 million in your backyard? Would you sell it or keep it? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about real-life treasures and incredible family drama, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.